is going to be very emotional, and we know it's going to have an effect on society. Remember, we're starting to memorialize George this week. And so his family would ask that you bear that in mind as we all try to take a breath for George. The reason why I said earlier that that ambulance was essentially a hearse for George Floyd, because based on all apparent evidence, George was dead on that scene. The medics, based on the EMT report that we have in our possession, performed post checks several times, finding none, and delivered one shock by their monitor. But George's condition did not change. They delivered him to the hospital, continuing ventilation, but their last report was the patient was still pulseless. The ambulance was the hearse. At this time, you will hear from my co-counsel, Attorney Tony ROMANUCCI, who is going to talk about some of the legal culpable aspects of this matter, and then we will get to the findings. Attorney ROMANUCCI.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ben, Drs. Wilson and Dr. Baden, thank you very much. And it is my honor to be one of the attorneys representing the family of George Floyd. Make no mistake about it, this case is about the Minneapolis Police Department and Derek Chauvin and the shameless standby police officers who were on scene, who had every opportunity to stop and prevent a senseless death, a needless one. They were compliant with with Officer Chauvin, who had his knee on George's neck. This was a brutal and public display of an 8-minute prolonged death. This was the lowest level of human respect and dignity that any community should ever have to endure. What this really was the weight of the Minneapolis Police Department on George's neck. And what you're going to hear from the doctors is that there were 2 actual physical mechanisms that were in place that caused George Floyd's death. As Ben alluded to, not only was the knee on George's neck a cause of his death, but so was the weight of the other 2 police officers on his back, who not only prevented blood flow into his brain, but also airflow into his lungs. That makes all of those officers on scene criminally liable and, without a doubt, civilly responsible. Had the Minnesota Police Department instituted the reforms it promised it would when it came to chokeholds and restraints, George would be alive. That's because the Minnesota Police Department, through its custom practices and policies, failed to train its police officers, failed to discipline police officers like Officer Chauvin, kept them there, kept them on scene, kept them on the police department. The Minneapolis Police Department promised that it would train its police officers on chokeholds and restraints. It promised that back as long as 2013, and it failed to do it. What you see on the video is exactly what happened. Those police officers were the proximate cause of George Floyd's death. And that's what you're going to hear in medical terminology from the doctors who will speak after me. This represents extreme and systemic failures on the part of the Minneapolis Police Departments. Opportunities not only that they had on the day that this happened, but for years and years to eliminate the institutional bias and racism against people of color. George Floyd was pronounced guilty before they even knew what he did. He was a non-violent offender. From what we know, it was a $20 counterfeit bill. And what did we see take place? You saw in action the blue shield. That police officer who stood in front and watched while the other 3 police officers held him down, he's culpable too. That's the blue shield in action. There was no prevention on anyone's part to save George's life. Sometime tomorrow, you're also going to hear from a brave man, one of the witnesses who was on scene. He's going to speak to you also. He's going to speak to you because he was within feet of what was happening. He watched the public execution unfold because those officers knew that by continuing to restrain and choke, that they could end a life. A grade school child understands the basics that if you continue to choke a human being, that you will end a life. This brave young man will speak to you tomorrow about what he saw, about George, about what he was feeling as he knew he was dying, calling for his mother. Make no mistake, as I said earlier, this is not only about Officer Chauvin and those police officers. This is about the Minneapolis Police Department and its policies. Ladies and gentlemen, this death will not be in vain. There will be permanent and lifelong lasting change as a result of George's death. We will not let that go unescaped. Thank you.
All right, you're watching this live press conference right now held by the family, the attorneys representing the family of George Floyd. And what you're hearing right now is them placing the blame on all of the officers who have not been arrested as of yet. And we're going to turn back because what we want to hear are the medical findings of forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, who is just explaining the actual cause of George Floyd's death. This seems to be actually in defeat with what we're seeing from the state in their medical examiner's findings. So if we can, let's jump back live and we'll hear.
That we have to look not only at the video that tells us in common sense what happened, but that we apply that with the forensic science, because it's critical. And one should not suggest that we didn't see what we saw, and what we saw should be consistent with what the science purports. As Attorney ROMANUCCI and I have said, the ambulance was a hearse. Why was this? Because not only the knee to his neck, but also the knees to his back that compressed his lungs and frustrated them from being able to contract, to take air in and out. So even if there's an opinion that there was no harm to his trachea, that is not conclusive in any way as to what caused his death. These doctors are going to explain it to you as the medical professionals they are, but as a simple person being a voice for equal justice, trying to tell the people who watched that video, that horrific video, when everybody else could see that they were killing them, except the police, or did they know they were killing them? You can look at the knees to the back as we've all looked at the knees to his neck, because they are both significant. Mr. Floyd's death was a homicide by the officers who taunted him while holding him down for more than 8 minutes. And the officers who stood by Tony by doing nothing, as you said, was a physical blue shield. The blue shield we always talk about in the black community. A living symbol of the code of silence from these suggested good officers seeing bad officers brutalize us, but saying nothing. Thank God there were witnesses and video on that night as George struggled for breath. At this time, I am honored to introduce a new voice from the medical field in these type matters. I know Dr. Baden and I have worked on several of these matters together, but today it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. ALLECIA Wilson, Director of Autopsy and Forensic Sciences at the University of Michigan. Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon. We acknowledge that additional medical information, including toxicology and further investigation, are necessary for a final report. However, the evidence is consistent with mechanical asphyxia as the cause of death and homicide as the manner of death. Second autopsies in certain cases can be very important to confirm and or dispute the original diagnosis, to answer those unanswered questions, to collect and document evidence, and most importantly, to determine the cause and the manner of death. While beneficial, second autopsies do have their limitations, as we are not seeing the tissues in their original state, and some items may have been kept by the original pathologist. With that acknowledgement, we feel those items will not change or alter the primary cause of death of mechanical asphyxia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Incredibly honored to have you do this autopsy on behalf of the Floyd family. It means a lot more than you know to them and many of us. At this time, I will call a man that really needs no introduction. Dr. Michael Baden is one of the foremost forensic scientists in the world alive today. He has worked on some of the most high-profile autopsies in the modern era. He has a background in doing forensic pathology, not only for the police departments, but also for the social justice engineers like myself and Tony. I could go on and on about Dr. Michael Baden, but I think it best to hear him explain the autopsy and put it in context as only the great Dr. Michael Baden can. Dr. Baden.
Thank you, Ben. The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. This is confirmed by information provided to Dr. Wilson and myself from the family. He was in good health. The compressive pressure of the neck and back are not seen at autopsy because the pressure has been released by the time the body comes to the medical examiner's office. It can only be seen, serious compressive pressure on the neck and back can only be seen while the pressure is being applied, or when, as in this instance, it is captured on video. And in this instance, we can see after a little bit less than 4 minutes that Mr. Floyd is motionless, lifeless, and when the EMS arrived and put him on the stretcher without any CPR at that time, during the ambulance trip, he did not respond to CPR and did not respond to cardiac shock. The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing. When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true. I am talking and talking and talking and not breathing in front of you. So the concept that a person says, "I can't breathe," like Mr. Garner, like in this instance, means you should take it seriously. And I think that I've finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baden. And again, to you and Dr. Wilson, on behalf of the George family, they are so very grateful that you performed this autopsy for them. And we know some of the things are going to make people emotional because this is an emotional case. Watching a person die is always just a horrific emotional thing, but to watch an individual die like this is something that causes a psychological scar in an individual's mind that is never repaired. The scar tissue of George Floyd's death will be permanent scar tissue on the subconscious of America. And we say again, as emotional as this is, let's all take a breath, not just for justice, not just for peace, but take a breath to heal our communities all across America. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George in peace, because that's what George would have wanted. And I'm honored again to be with Attorney Tony ROMANUCCI, Attorney Storms, Attorney Ravindran, Attorney Ward, Attorney Stewart, these great lawyers who are representing the family of George Floyd. We're going to take some of your questions now. Please type them in the Q&A box and identify yourself and your media organization. For those who haven't done this before, you can click on the small hand icon on the right-hand side of your screen to make sure that you have
Wow. Okay, so that's major. Based upon these findings, they are inconsistent with the ME's reports that, according to the doctors you just heard, George Floyd died from asphyxiation, and that the
Will you
other
be making
officers
copies of the
were
autopsy
able
available? This question's for the
to
doctor.
kill him, that they were a contributing cause to
Dr.
his
Bauer,
death. On top of the fact, unlike the ME's reports, you just heard the doctors say there were no underlying health conditions that contributed to his death. So there is a lot to break down here in terms of what does this mean to the current defendant, former officer Derek Chauvin? What does this mean for the other officers? We have a lot to break down, and we are going to do that at 5 p.m. tonight, 5 p.m. Eastern on Law and Crime Now. Tune in then. Right now, back to your regularly scheduled program.